This is the New Quantum Era, and I'm your host, Sebastian Hassinger. In this episode, we're going to shift our usual focus from the science and technology research to the broader societal context that surrounds this moment in the development of the field of quantum information science and technology. Our guest today is Alejandra Castillo, Chancellor Senior Fellow at Purdue University Northwest and former Assistant Secretary for Economic Development at the U.S. Department of Commerce, where she became the first woman of color to lead the Economic Development Administration. Over a career spanning federal government, nonprofit leadership, and regional economic strategy, Alejandra has focused on building inclusive, innovation-driven ecosystems that translate emerging technologies into opportunity for all communities, including those who have too often been left behind. Alejandra and I talk about how quantum is actually much closer than many people think in terms of economic development and impact, not just in computing, but across a broader set of industries for which quantum engineering will be relevant, and how traditional industries like biopharma are already placing serious bets on quantum capabilities. We dig into the CHIPS and Science Act, the role of EDA tech hubs and NSF engines, and why she sees quantum as a national security issue that demands consistent investment rather than sporadic excitement. We also zoom in on the Midwest, where Alejandra has deliberately embedded herself to explore how Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin are collaborating through efforts like the Chicago Quantum Exchange, the Illinois Quantum and Microelectronics Parks, Quantum Corridor, and the new Roberts Impact Lab at Purdue Northwest. Along the way, we unpack what a truly inclusive quantum workforce looks like beyond PhDs, why cross-state coalitions matter more than state borders, and how planning now on workforce, supply chains, housing, and infrastructure can help us avoid repeating the scramble we're experiencing with AI. One quick note, I stumbled over the name of the publication where Alejandra just published an op-ed. It's Crane's Chicago Business, and there's a link to that article in the show notes. If you're interested in how quantum can become a broad-based economic engine for growth and what it'll take to align federal policy, regional strategy, and community-level inclusion, this conversation is for you. Well, Alejandra, thank you very much for joining me today. I'm really excited about this conversation. I read the editorial in the Chicago Business Review, I think, right, in Crane's, that was under your, that you wrote just recently. And I thought the perspective was exactly dead on, but we'll get into that. If you could start by just introducing yourself and talking a little bit about your background, that would be terrific.
Sure. So I usually like to introduce myself as the perpetual 3-year-old who's curious about everything. And I think you and I
identify with that.
Exactly. I think you and I share it. And right now, after having served as Assistant Secretary for Economic Development, what I realized, one is that we need to think about regional ecosystem building. We also need to really tackle what these emerging technologies mean all about. So I've had a career both in and out of federal government. I've led nonprofit organizations. I've been a bit of jack of all trade, master of none type of thing. But at the end of the day, at this point in my life, I feel I have a toolbox filled with amazing opportunities and tools to bring communities together so that we can actually advance inclusive and equitable ecosystem buildings and bring these emerging technologies to market. So I'll leave it at that.
There's so many things that I want to follow up on just in that brief introduction. But I mean, you're saying master of none, but you're actually the first woman of color to lead the EDA in the federal government. So was that primarily the activity? Was that primarily focused on CHIPS Act, or was it a broader perspective than those investments?
Yeah. So I'll very quickly. I served in the at the U.S. Department of Commerce under Obama. And then under Biden. And I know the Department of Commerce very well, and I have great admiration for the work that is done. So the Economic Development Administration was something that had always tugged at my heart. EDA for many, many years was the only federal agency that focused exclusively on economic development, but it had a very small budget. Under the previous administration, that budget grew to almost $8.6 billion, in large part because of this understanding that we needed to rev up the economic engine of places that had been, in some ways, left behind, where there had been a massive economic transition away from, example, from coal or steel or manufacturing. And we needed to reimagine what those different places could do and the assets that they had. So it was in large part fueled by the CHIPS and Science Act. A lot of folks talk about the CHIPS piece, but the science component of that is really where I think is fascinating. And that's where both EDA and National Science Foundation, through its Engines program, joined forces in many ways to allocate funding to coalitions or consortiums that could come together and really take these emerging technologies in a very comprehensive way.
Right. So that explains sort of where your path intersected quantum. I'm guessing this is certainly what draws me to quantum as a topic in terms of economic ecosystem development and equitable access to that development, is that it feels like, in a sense, a blank sheet of paper, right? To a certain degree, it's a nascent. It's not just an emerging technology; it's a nascent set of technologies where we have some idea of how it's going to develop because we've got the example of classical computing. But we don't know exactly, the sequencing and the frequency of the steps we're going to take. But it feels like an opportunity to make, try again in a sense, right? Do it over and hopefully learn from the lessons of the previous wave of classical IT. And is that where you see the opportunity for a more equitable kind of industry that emerges out of this sort of coming from?
So, Sebastian, I'm going to push back a bit because I think quantum is closer than most people think. I think, and it has so many different branches, right? You have quantum computing and quantum sensing and quantum communication. There's so many different aspects of it. And now that I am kind of embedded in the Midwest, and I did that deliberately, I'm seeing the incredible work that's being done, not just from the universities such as, University of Illinois and University of Chicago and Purdue, with the extraordinary work that Professor Mike Manfra is doing, but I'm also seeing the various private sector companies that are coming into this space, and we can go down the litany. One of them is Quantum Corridor, which is one of the companies that we work with. And I think when you and I first met, we were out in Santa Clara at the Q2B conference, and you heard about Quantum Corridor in terms of what they're doing and the entanglement that they're working on as well. But I really think that we are seeing now traditional industries investing in quantum opportunities. Biopharma, both Lilly and AbbVie are looking at that. We're looking at how the ecosystem is forming in terms of the National Quantum Algorithm Center in Chicago, and obviously the big investments that are happening at the Illinois Quantum and Microelectronic Park. So these are calculated big bets that are happening because the technology is maturing and there are so many interesting and fascinating discoveries. So now the question is, how do we take those applications to market? And that's going to require thinking about workforce and thinking about supply chain and thinking about so many other things.
Right. And that, I guess, is where the importance of the local, state and local government and organizations, commercial organizations, industry organizations as well, really comes into play, right? I mean, it's one thing for the federal government to say, we need to develop a workforce, we need to develop a supply chain, but the work is really going to happen at the local level, right? I mean, that seems to be the case, and at least from my perspective.
Without a doubt. Look, as I mentioned, I've spent much of my career in the federal space. My philosophy, if you will, of what the federal government can do is the federal government can help de-risk, right? It can provide funding to bring down the risk that the private sector or nonprofits can't sustain. But once it does that and you have the wheels of innovation and technology in motion, then you need other partners. And that is where still in the public sector, state and local, but in the nonprofit sector, in the philanthropic sector, as well as the private sector. So all of these are ingredients, and the absence of any one of these will prevent you from moving faster and in a more inclusive way.
Right. And going back to inclusivity and equitable access, I mean, I'll take the pushback on some elements of quantum technologies are more mature, and certainly they're having impact in other industries. I guess potentially I am a little tunnel visioned around quantum computing, quantum networking. Those are further away in terms of achieving the scale of classical computing, right? I mean, that's the heart of our modern society is classical computing.
Correct.
It's a long time before quantum gets to that sort of scale. Do you think that the early stage of this new set of computing technologies affords an opportunity to address the intrinsic inequality that's sort of been baked into classical computing?
So I think so. And here's why I continue to push back is because when I speak to folks, they dismiss having to address these matters, as you and I spoke about before we hit record, before the fact. I'm a witness when I was at Commerce, how AI in so many ways took us by surprise. And now you see how we're trying to, in some ways, and these are my words, scramble to organize.
I think that's fair.
How AI is impacting us. Are we going to make that same mistake again? Or should we start to think about and plan how quantum is going to also impact us? And I'll give you an example. Here at Purdue Northwest, we have the Roberts Impact Lab. And we are investing in it in collaboration with Quantum Corridor to make it a test bed for both quantum AI and post-quantum cryptography, but also make it a workforce development center in collaboration with some industry partners. So is that, that is leaning into the future. There are a lot of questions and uncertainties, but the fact is that it will happen. So let's get ready now and even have a conversation. And this is why I love your podcast, because as non-physicists, we're able to tackle this question from various lenses. And that's what's going to make it more inclusive so that, again, we're dealing with it before the fact and not after the fact.
Right. Okay, so you mentioned Illinois and Indiana and how you're embedded in the Midwest. And certainly I first encountered Chicago Quantum Exchange when David Oshland was getting it up off the ground. And I was at IBM at the time, and I was sitting across the table from the five universities that came together to join forces and create the CQE. It seems remarkably prescient, that set of moves. It's now being mimicked in a lot of other states, but Illinois, in some ways, and the region that they pull together with the CQE in the Midwest, has a head start. So, what are you sort of focusing on at this stage of the development of the region? What's sort of the priorities for the next couple of years of development? Because I think in some sense you in that pioneering role, you're actually providing an example for all these other regional efforts as well.
Yeah. So again, on the federal side, one could argue that this was all happening in tandem, right? Congress was considering what at the time was called Endless Frontier, which today we know as the CHIPS and Science Act. There was a lot of conversations. Many of the political stakeholders, Senator Young, Senator Durbin, Duckworth, and others were really trying to shape that piece of legislation. Again, in addition to the chips and semiconductors, on the science piece. So the fact that there were dollars, pretty large scale dollars, authorized in that legislation, and I use that word deliberately because $10 billion was authorized, only $500 million has been appropriated, and I'll go back to that in a second. It was a way for EDA in particular to design that program as consortiums. And the reason I say that is because no one state is going to do this, right? And building on the assets, both Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, was critical because we needed to bring all of these people together. So that was the design of tech hubs. Engines, which is another program under NSF, is also helping in mobilize that and move that forward. But what keeps me up at night is how do we actually take populations across 3 states, 1, inform them, 2, excite them about what's coming, as well as thinking about what are those jobs of the future. And in order for people to get those jobs of the future, what type of reskilling, upskilling, credentials, micro-credentials training will we need to put in place so that this real economic engine can rev up and people see technology not as a displacement, but as an opportunity for better jobs? That's a quintessential question, right? But I think with intention and we can actually make that happen.
Yeah. And the when I first started hearing the term quantum workforce, the focus was really on the PhD pipeline, and it's still obviously incredibly critical. If you're going to design qubits, you probably need a PhD. However, when you talk about the broader jobs outlook, I mean, just the development effort in Illinois with the campus that's being built, that's a lot of really quality jobs. And do you think that's, I mean, how do you broaden the conversation so that it's not just narrowly we need more scientists, but we need all of these cross-disciplinary skills and sets of capabilities? And how do you also make sure that it's not a one-off and it's a continuing kind of growing force in the economy?
Yeah, so there are some amazing individuals in all of these institutions that we have named already who are focusing on it, right? A good portion of the Tech Hub's application requires projects in workforce. And, I see it as we need to do a workforce mapping, which is what are the jobs, what are the skills that are going to be that will be required, and we also need to do a supply chain mapping, right? What are the type of companies who will be suppliers into this broader industry? When you start to see both the supply chain and the workforce mapping, then you start to say, okay, so these are the type of jobs that will definitely be created. These are the type of individuals who will be coming to the region, and who's going to provide them the housing. How are we going to think about the transportation? How are we going to think about so many other concentric circles around this? It's not for the faint of heart, but boy, is it interesting and it's exciting.
Yeah. And I guess that speaks to one of the major points you made in the editorial as well, that this is something that requires sort of top to bottom collaboration, right? The federal government can help with incentives and setting agenda setting type of activity, but really, as you said, as that impact, in order to really realize the full potential of that impact, you need things like housing and urban planning and infrastructure and all of the rest of those nuts and bolts of local government to be working in tandem. Is that something that's sort of, I don't know, are there unique aspects of that challenge in this quantum wave of development, or is that just something that happens with every new sort of economic driver of this sort?
So, I think that the way that we've been addressing this in the last few years has been a bit more intentional. Clearly, emerging technologies can happen organically, but I think that the better course is if we can have some level of both planning and consistency. And I'm going to drill down a little bit on the consistency level. As the federal government, we need more consistency in how these programs are funded, and also predictability that the federal government will stand for the long haul. And this is where I'm going to, my next article is really about.
Oh, good.
We need to make sure that we are giving this unique technology both the funding and the attention, because this is a national security threat. And you and I can go into another podcast series about the threats. But more importantly, the moment I'm using this kind of phrasing, we either focus on the urgency or we're going to have to focus on the emergency. Because it could happen, right?
Yeah.
When you have foreign adversaries that are putting $15 billion into this, and the U.S. can barely put in $500 million, and even then we're still wondering if possibly or maybe it's going to continue, that hampers the level of research, of lab to market.
Absolutely.
So that's the other layer.
And is there, beyond advocacy from people like yourself with the sort of experience and the perspective to make those types of observations, is there a role for these regional efforts to try to get that kind of consistency and dependability out of the federal government? Is there some pressure we can put on them?
Yeah, so I think we need to do both. Obviously, we need to continue to put the pressure on federal funding. But what's also fascinating is that there are stakeholders that are already convinced as to why this is such an urgent, that they are also being very innovative and bringing in other sources of capital and resources. So I don't want to put it all on the federal government because but I am also saying that we need both. In the absence of the federal government, we're seeing people being a bit more creative, as well as, other sources of capital. My only cautionary tale is that other sources of capital may not necessarily have inclusion as a driver, right? That's why the public space is so important, because we have other metrics of success that are not just return. We want to make sure that entire regions can actually reposition themselves from an economic perspective.
Yeah, and I mean that's a really good point, and I always feel like that's so short-sighted to think that prioritizing, access and equitable access and inclusion is somehow undermining return. It may be expanding the time horizon, but quantitatively, again and again, the data shows that the more inclusive, the better, the larger the overall benefits are from the investment. I mean, do you think this provides an opportunity maybe to try to finally convince people of that fact, of the value, to the greater value to everybody across the board for being more inclusive, being more equitable, and building for a society, for building the value for society at large?
Yeah. So on a personal note, as I mentioned at the onset, I'm a New Yorker. I spent much of my career in Washington. This is my first time living in the Midwest. And I've fallen in love with the Midwest and other places around the country. But we have to call out that when it comes to tech and innovation and capital, it's been the coasts. And it has left so many places that are incredibly are well positioned. So I talk about Chicago, Illinois, Wisconsin. Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. But
yeah.
I could also talk about Colorado and New Mexico, which are doing some incredible things. I could also
talk. Quantum is a great effort.
Yeah, I can talk to you about Tulsa, Oklahoma, which has become the drone capital of the U.S. And when we talk about inclusion, I also want to make sure that people understand that we're looking at inclusion also, and most importantly, sometimes from a geographical perspective. Because if the U.S. only develops its coast and forgets about what the heartland is all about, we fail to understand that we need to make sure that we're revving up regions across the country in terms of where those opportunities are, so that people can stay in the places that they call home. Right? that was my big narrative when I was at Commerce. We want to talk about the places people call home. And Northwest Indiana, when I hear the stories about people who worked in the steel mills and how their grandparents were able to buy their first home, how can we do the same? But now we're talking about quantum.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you reminded me actually when I interviewed Dana Anderson from Inflection, there was a great phrase he used, which was, he said, in the coming years, a company that's not operating at the quantum limits won't be competitive. And he meant it in a very expansive way. He didn't mean specifically quantum computing or quantum networking, as you said, sort of the broader perspective of we're capable of engineering at these incredibly small tolerances. In some senses, the NVIDIA story is about engineering at a quantum scale. These are 2 nanometer leads in the actual chip. So yeah, I mean, it does connect, I think, to what you're saying about this wave of almost a new industrialization that has a quantum technology flavor to it that it allows us to sort of renew the investment in, as you say, the productiveness of where people live instead of forcing them to displace. That's fantastic. So do you think, given your involvement in the Midwest now, are there sort of, top lessons learned at this point from the Illinois CQE Midwestern experience? As I said, you're sort of in the lead. Are there things that you think other regions should learn from that example?
Absolutely, and I do want to call out Kate Timmerman
she's great.
Quantum Block, who's fantastic and really has been the driver of all of this. Big kudos to her and the team there, as well as their approach to making sure that when they speak about quantum, while much of the visual and announcements may sound more Chicago-like, it's bringing what Wisconsin is doing, what Indiana is doing together. So having that intentionality is critical, as well as the many stakeholders. I just had a great breakfast with Juan Salgado, who leads the Chicago Community College. But here in Indiana, we have Ivy Tech. We have obviously Purdue and Purdue Northwest, as well as on the Wisconsin side. So I think that the lesson learned is that no one state can do this alone. I think the other piece is we all have to bring all of our assets, right? We talk about quantum, but we also have done a lot of research on energy, water, land, rail, all of the traditional infrastructure that will undergird this, because we can't fail to understand that as well. That's important. But I think lessons learned is, making sure that at some point, and it's hard, we erase those political lines that divide our states. This is a regional play that we will be called to answer for the sake of a national security play as well. So if we could surpass some of those dividing lines, boy, we could do incredible things, as they have already done. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I really share your optimism. As you said, the AI moment we're in does feel like a bit of a scramble, and I hope that we can draw the lessons from that put the right level of attention and investment in this coming wave, because it would be much better, as you said beautifully, to act with urgency instead of react to an emergency. I think that's very well put. If I may, I also want to underscore, yes, we can talk about quantum computing but quantum has so many different iterations. The other piece that you and I heard was that in addition to the advancements that have been made on the computing side and on the hardware side, the part that's really interesting also is on the algorithm side. Mm-hmm. And I bring that up because Gabriel Seidman is leading the National Quantum Algorithm Center, and they are looking at both algorithms that can bring quantum technology and solving for natural disasters, or quantum as it relates to both biopharma and opportunities to unleash incredible pharmacological discoveries. They're looking at how can quantum really intersect with some of the most pressing challenges that we have in society. And that is yet again exciting. And we need the physicists just like we need the other players, so that we can actually bring this in a more positive way as to how is this going to improve the lives of people.
Right. Well, I think that's a tremendous motivator across the board, and I share your optimism, as I said, for this sort of new wave of motivation behind this investment. So I really appreciate your time, Alejandra. This has been really, really fun, and as I said, it's filled me with a bunch of hope, which is a good thing.
We need a dose of hope
Definitely.
these days, so yes.
Definitely. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the podcast, a production of the New Quantum Era, hosted by me, Sebastian Hassinger, with theme music by OCH. You can find past episodes on www.newquantumera.com or on Blue Sky at newquantumera.com. If you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe and tell your quantum curious friends to give it a listen.